Can I just repeat that question? Just because I know some people might not have heard it over here. I hope I sum it up correctly. The basics is that, has there been any human remains that have been preserved the same layer as some of the remains of or fossils of animals from millions of years ago? I got a nod. Good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good question. I can't talk about the actual footprints. I've not seen them, so I can't comment on that. And one of the things we do as CMI, Creation Ministry scientists, we absolutely will not comment on what we've not seen or researched ourselves. I'm sure there's someone in CMI, if you send a question to, we have a Q&A on our site, they'll give you that. But I will comment on the actual humans. Why don't we find lots of human fossils amongst all the others that we do? The simple reason is that's not an evolutionary sequence. I'm going to be totally bold here. It's a death sequence during a flood. Now, why would you only fossilise certain creatures that died and not others? Now remember, as I said, the majority of fossils are from marine and they are smaller. The next category is you'll find coastal organisms, particularly slow-moving organisms are the next large category of fossils. When you eventually get to the dinosaurs, they're a fraction, but one thing is clear about them too, is the majority lived in swampy coastal environments. Then when you talk about mammals and so on, things that could move, there are very few fossils at all. Now, what does that mean? It means that there was a drowning sequence as the water raised over 40 days, that if you had some legs, what are you going to do with them? Run. What do you think the horses did? Ran. Etc. In other words, if you could get away, you would get away as best you could. So the number of you dying in the early stages would have been potentially quite low. Just as what happens now. When a flood comes, what do the animals do? They take off, leaving those that can't take off, the creek or the estuarine or the marine, they're the ones. But there's another feature here, since you've raised this, really fascinating one. When does the sediment come during a flood? Now this is interesting. Now I'm going to try and get you to imagine a graph in front of you. I'm a graph, okay? And here's the height of the water going up, and you're going to see what you call a hydrograph, a flood flow. It's going to start low, and it's going to rise up, and then it's going to fall. It took 40 days to rise, and then fell. We see them in every flood. The water rises, and then it might stay there for a bit, but then it drops down again. But when does the sediment come? It's called a hysteretic effect. The sediment comes before the peak of the flood. So while a flood does that, the sediment comes up immediately at the beginning of a flood because it's already been pre-prepared and available and the turbulence, etc. And by the time you reach the peak of the flood, it's gone. Effectively gone. The majority of sediment. So if you need sediment to create a fossil, what's it going to fossilise the most? The very first things it can contact, because that's when the sediment's available. By day 40, there's not much left of the sediment. So if you drown then, you're just going to bloat and float. I'm sorry, you are not going to become a fossil. Now I don't have any problems that we may one day find one, because there's bound to be, but the absolute probability of that, you would expect to be low, just like you would any other advanced creature that had the ability to move, cling on to wood, do something. Because it had to be in the earliest stages of the flood to capture the fossilisation. Hope that's answered your question.
So when you're talking about the layers there, you're talking about the connection to the pre-flood to the post-flood situation. Yes. There's a number of arguments out there amongst scientists about, Christian scientists, about the pre-flood situation. But again, we were not there. I think the problem we face with the pre-flood situation is the flood itself is of a magnitude and a scale we cannot even comprehend. It was absolutely, it was chaotic, it was violent, it was absolutely, just messed everything up. Now, people do say, well, what happened to Mt Everest during the flood? The answer is Mt Everest wasn't there during the flood. Neither were the Rockies or the Andes or any of those. How do we know? Because they're riddled with fossils, not on the surface, on the outer part, they're riddled with fossils all the way through. In other words, during the flood, they were the sediments laid down that the Lord later lifted. As he says in one of the Psalms, he lifted that and the ocean floors were pressed down. So none of the landscape you see today, we argue, can be explained in anything connection to what the landscape was pre-flood. And so most of those mountains actually are sedimentary, and they come after the flood as the Lord raised it. That's why we only have 30% of the planet dry, and the 70% is actually the flood waters still there. They're still there. So where did the sediments come from? They came from a violence that we can't even properly conceptualise, to be honest. We've got people who have tried, again, look it up on the literature, people like Michael Lord have tried to, he's he's a meteorologist type character who's become a geomorphologist. He's tried to map in the physics of it and the global Earth, air circulation and then the oceanic circulation that might have occurred. But again, we just can't really come to grips because we were not there. All we see as the evidence is massive, massive sedimentation of a scale that today cannot be achieved, not even a pinch of it. So again, unfortunately, that's a question we really can't look at, the connection between the old and the new. If that's...
Good question. Peter?
Yeah, I was just thinking about in terms of the amount of water that would have been for the flood to cover the whole Earth. You just mentioned there that the ocean floors after were pushed down. So you're saying that the water that's on the Earth today is the flood water?
Absolutely. If I was to take the planet surface now and level the land, the water would be sitting 3 kilometres above the Earth, over the entire Earth. And so there is no problem with that, in a sense. 3 kilometres depth would occur. Now, the land is not like that. The Lord raised it. So there is no problem that being the actual water. I mean, where would it go is the other question. So, that's another question. We don't know. But there's no reason to say it's not the flood waters. Now, that is actually interesting. People ask, where did the flood waters come from? And that is an interesting question. And today, we're still doing measurements, of course, but the estimate, we have discovered water deep down. Now, the early scientists said that was not possible. The Bible is wrong. The earth could not have been split open and the waters would not have come up from underground because there are no waters. That's not what we found today. With much better technology, we have found that the water under and deep into the crust is 3 to 10 times larger in volume than the entire oceans are today. So he actually only opened them up for a short time, closed them back up again. But there's 3 to 10 times. It's the measurement techniques that we're refining as we try to work that out. They're the techniques that we used in Libya.
Thanks, Peter.
Good question.
And there's someone else? I saw raise their hand.
I assume that a lot of secular scientists are well-meaning as they go about their work. But in face of all evidence, why is there a insistence on ignoring the evidence in a seemingly unscientific manner?
Why do scientists today, in the presence of this evidence, seem to ignore it? A very interesting question, something that actually challenged me both after I became a Christian and before it as well. And one thing I did note is that in all my travels, the secular scientists who travel with me came to the same conclusion, that there was a catastrophic global flood. But they're the ones who travelled, and they saw evidence in different situations and in different environments and different pieces of evidence all pointing. Now, if you take a classic scientist, lovely people, but many of them in a laboratory or in a microbe lab somewhere else, they're actually constrained within a sort of environment that they're working in, like any other person. It's rather fascinating. I noted that those scientists who travel extensively have a much different attitude to those who don't travel, which are the bulk of them. They don't travel. I've been pondering that question myself for quite some time, is that I think, as I was in the early days, because it took me, 30 years of seeing pieces of evidence time and time again for it to break in me. Because what you tend to do is you go, look, interesting, but that's probably an odd example. That's probably an unusual case. That tends to be what you get. But only when you see so many of them do you start to feel that. that there is something here. Now, the other secular scientists said to me from day one when I started questioning this, don't raise it. We see the same evidence as we travel the world in Malawi and other places that yes, there is evidence of a catastrophic flood, but the moment you say that, your career is over. So that's the only piece of sort of sharing I can give on that. I sort of haven't really worked that one out as to why so many. I'm not putting any negativity on them at all. I think it's just that they are so focused on their particular topic, in their particular case, they get locked into a paradigm, locked into a theory. Why? Because it's drilled into them time and time again. You won't get your PhD basically these days if you really start to step outside that. I've seen a number of them fail because they've stepped outside. You have to almost become a true believer. And it's not, I'm not saying that's being negative, I'm just saying that's the way it works in your own study program.
Time for one more question at least. Yes, please.
What is basement rock?
Oh, you're talking about basement rock. I presume you're referring to the original rock. Yes, there is a basement rock which is, the interaction between the two is often called an unconformity, a great unconformity between them, because you see this incredible rock which has been smoothed. And so then sediment sits upon that in layers. And often, I didn't go into the details, but those sediments do appear in certain layers of, coarser sandstone, finer materials and so on. That is often considered the great unconformity of the actual, in a sense, the torn apart planet. That's the actual rock surface, because the whole thing was just torn apart.
So when the water sort of circulates the ground, actually ground into the level.
Yeah, it's not always ground down that well, but it is certainly, it's unexplainable as to how well it is ground. Let's put it that way. So you do have this rock, and under the Grand Canyon is a great one. It goes on for thousands of kilometres, square kilometres, of a rock, which might be a granite or something like that, so it's an igneous rock of some sort, but it is smoothened. And that is believed to be the floodwaters with the massive amounts of sediment, which, when you talk about that amount of sediment moving, it's going to grind everything down. Yes. So I think that's probably what you're talking about, the great unconformity that underlies the... Yep.
And one last question for the night. Oh no, we'll go for this guy with the blue.
Come and see me afterwards.
According on what you presented tonight, it appears that we might have been deceived in schools through the years of the way evolution and also the way the world was created and also the tectonic plates and how they move around. There's a lot more to this than we've been taught at schools or schools.
In terms of, well, it's a broad question because you're looking at education there and time and so on. I mean, we have been challenged as a Christian body for hundreds of years now as this has come about. It's not accidental, this challenge, by the way. It is quite a focus of the atheistic group. Just to add a point to that, I'll often say in a message, do you notice the atheists and the false teachers don't attack Christ himself so much or attack you because of your belief in Christ? What they attack is what we understand about the book of Genesis, about the origins, about the... Why? Because the very purpose of Christ is built on that. Christ didn't have to live a physical life. He didn't have to go through a physical death if all of that was untrue. Atheistic and the false teachers attack Genesis, and they've done it for hundreds of years. So that's a foundation that we've been building upon. From the educational point of view, I'll stay away from that. I'm not in the secondary schools. But I know that... So, yeah, it's a broad question. I'm happy to chat afterwards if you like. We can focus on one of those points. But no, thank you.
And we'll wrap it up there. So there's a little bit more time to catch up with Dr. Neller.
Happy to.
And his wife Julie. Thank you very much all for coming. I hope you'll come next week. Very different talks. We love making it eclectic. And so thank you very much for coming. I hope you, and pray that you've got a lot out of tonight. Bye.
Thank you.